This year marks the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the end of the Second World War. While the history of the European and American theaters of World War II is generally well understood, the Asian theater receives much less attention. Few people know, for example, that China was the first nation to fight against fascist forces as early as in 1931, 8 years before Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Again, people know the extent of Germany's rampage in Europe, but few understand how far Japan's imperial reach actually went and the crimes committed in this part of the world. Why is there such an apparent black hole in people's collective consciousness? Exactly what happened in this part of the world during those bloody years, and why does it matter to you to revisit this episode in history now? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Lund, Sweden by Jan Ahlberg, co-founder of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research, from Taipei, Taiwan Province, by Professor Liu Fu-Kuo, research fellow at the Institute of International Relations at the National Cheng Chi University, from Manila, the Philippines, by Romel Banloy, president of the Philippine Society for International Security Studies, from Shanghai by Joseph Mahoney, professor at East China Normal University, and last but not least from Beijing by Zhao Hai, director of the International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy. Gentlemen, welcome to this special edition of The Point. First of all, let's give you just a little bit more details about what I mentioned about China started much earlier than people generally thought in its fight against fascism. Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China on July the 7th, 1937, but the country's struggle against fascism actually started in September 18th of 1931, when Japanese troops began their invasion of northeast China. That's when China counted as the start of its war of aggression against Japanese imperial forces. Professor Liu in Taiwan, let me go to you first. Help us understand this part of history, the Asian theater of the Second World War, and what kind of contributions does this part of the war theater make to the overall victory of the global fight against fascism?
Thank you so much for inviting me to come to such a timely and critical discussion on air. And into this particular question, and I think it is very important to look back how exactly this Asian scenario immediately right after the World War II. And importantly, as we recognize, after the World War II, there were five powers in the world. China, at that time, Republic of China, was the only one from Asia which showed a tremendous effort fight against Japanese power. So altogether, the war lasted for much longer time as people expected, more than 8 to 10 years. Actually, Japanese invaded China much earlier. From the record, normally Chinese people altogether recognize there were 8 years. But most importantly, as I want to quickly touch upon, from political and security institution built up right after the end of the World War II. Most importantly, as the war ended, and then it came with the San Francisco Peace Treaty. But of course, at that time, China was in the Civil War, was not invited to attend the San Francisco Peace Treaty. So that was the reason why, looking into what happens in Asia today, so much important issue left behind, unsolved. Of course, all the post-war international order was actually manipulated by the United States at that time. So even if on the bright side, a number of international institutions were developed, like a United Nations, Bretton Woods system, and all that. But importantly, looking from Asia, so much of things have not been solved.
We get your main points. Let me go to Mr. Zhao Hai. Mr. Zhao, actually in China, we are now talking about China's war against Japanese aggression starting in 1931, which means it lasted until 1945, 14 years, well ahead of the Western recognized starting point of the Second World War, which was 1939. Help us understand the rationale behind this new recognition.
Well, it's very important to recognize that Japan invaded Northeast China, back then called Manchuria, in 1931, which started the Chinese resistance against Japanese aggression. By then, the Japanese government has already developed into a militarism government and state. And also, right after that, back then, the so-called League of Nations sent particular commissions to investigate the incident. However, they failed to resolve the aggression and push back against the Japanese. Once they did try to do that, the Japanese actually quit the League of Nations. That led to the breakdown of the international system back then. So since then, China has been fighting Japanese alone and later on together with the Soviet Union, with the United States for 14 years and shouldered many of the majority of the burden fighting against Japanese fascism and militarism. So that's why at the end of the war, China has been recognized as the founding member of the United Nations and also globally recognized as one of the major battlefield or major theaters fighting against global fascism in this World War II.
Jan Oberg in Sweden, what is your understanding about the history of Second World War here in Asia? What do you see as the main argument that China's fight against Japanese aggressors in its northeastern region since 1931 is and must be included in the global fight against Nazism that was thought to start in 1939 officially, but actually China's fight against for its northeastern regions since 1931 is an integral part of that. How do you understand it?
Well, let me say first, thank you very much for having me here. Secondly, I think it's part of a larger, if you will, ignorance in the West, and perhaps also a way of avoiding talking about it. That to many Westerners, everything happened in Europe with the dominance of the European scene from Germany and the Hitler philosophy ideology. But I think it's very good you're doing this program also for Western viewers to get a sense of how much earlier actually it started in your part of the world. And I would like to add, it's grossly underestimated how the Cold War was also not just an issue, the Cold War that followed. It was not just an issue between, if you will, the Warsaw Pact and NATO, or the Soviet Union and the West, or between communism and liberal democracy. It always had a branch, a relation, because the Americans took over and dominated the country that was your occupier and destroyer and enemy, with military bases all over the place, etc. So the Cold War has always had a dimension between the two Western brothers in Europe, if you will, and an Orient-Occident, if I may say so, dimension of what happened, because we shouldn't forget that this is definitely it went from a hot war to a Cold War. And secondly, I would like, since we're talking Asia, to remind everybody about the fact that in 1945 the United States bombed Japan with nuclear weapons, and that shaped the whole era since 45 up till today.
Okay, we'll talk about that in just a moment because you mentioned a very important event in history which probably shaped the perception of Japan, of Japanese aggression in the minds of a lot of Western people. But let me go to Remel in the Philippines. What happened in the Philippines? According to the National World War II Museum in the United States, Philippines military deaths amounted to 59,000. We don't know whether that is the official Philippine account. Its total civilian military deaths range from 500,000 to about 1 million, and they are victims of Japanese aggression.
Well, we are challenging the Western narrative of Philippine experiences during the Second World War, and younger scholars, including me, are now discovering new findings that during the Second World War there was a strong resistance of Filipinos against Japanese imperial forces, and that kind of resistance was a continuation of Filipino resistance against colonialism that started against Spain, then Americans, and then the Japanese. And what is not known by the public in the world is that during these resistance movements, Filipinos were aided by a lot of Chinese in the Philippines during the colonial period of Spain and America. And in fact, during the Japanese period, there was a strong battalion, the WWII battalion, composed of Chinese nationals and Filipino Chinese, aiding Filipino resistance movements against the Japanese during the Second World War, especially in Central Luzon. And now we are telling that to the whole world that there was a strong cooperation of Chinese in the Philippines and Filipinos in resisting colonialism and in resisting colonial occupation. Yeah, there was heavy devastations, severe abuse and exploitation of Filipinos. And one major issue that is still lingering now in the Philippines is the abuse of women, the comfort women. The physical and the infrastructural damage we are still experiencing now. We can still a lot of ruins in the Philippines because of the Japanese occupation. So the estimate of the United States, I think it's still a very conservative estimate, because if you will account all the unrecorded and undocumented sufferings and even damages to the Filipino people, it can be more.
Joseph, what is your understanding of the reach of Japan's invasion and occupation during the Second World War in Asia, and what could the casualties have been?
Well, I think, we play with different numbers. We say 1937, this is when we saw the Battle of Shanghai and the rape of Nanjing. We talk about 1931 as being an earlier date, but I think we have to go back to 1895. That's when China's struggle with Imperial Japan really began. That's when we saw Japan taking by force Taiwan and some of the key islands in the coastal areas. And then later, following the Treaty of Versailles, when Shandong was gifted to Japan, that's another important milestone in the struggle between what is becoming fascistic Japan and China's drive to become its own independent modern nation. So those are the things that are taking place. The question then is, how far did this reach go? Certainly we saw Japan responding to certain triggers. I mean, I think we have to hold Japan responsible, but let's keep in mind that Japan came to the competitive nation game late. It was competing with European powers. It wanted to expand its own sphere of influence in Asia, primarily directed against China, but many other places, to compete with this Western model. And let's recall that when the Americans came in and undercut the Filipino independence movement, which was struggling against Spain, and then built what was then the second foreign naval base in Asia, the first being the German one in Shandong. This is something that really provoked the Japanese, and it's one of the reasons why immediately after they attacked Pearl Harbor, they invaded the Philippines, because this again was Japan trying to find its own solution, however dark and misguided, to this new world order, this aggressive new world order that the West had instigated.
Professor Liu, let me go back to you. For China, there was very painful history of Taiwan being colonized and occupied by Japanese forces for 50 years, from 1895 to 1945. Professor Mahoney just mentioned that date. China was forced to annex this piece of land to Japan because it lost the first so-called Sino-Japanese War, which took place in 1895. So what has been the crimes that have been committed by Japanese aggressors on the island of Taiwan, and for how long?
For these colonial 50 years, Taiwanese people suffered tremendously under Japanese rule. Much part of China during the Second World War was occupied by Japan. Similarly, Taiwanese people, on the one side, young men were recruited to send to the army, fight in Southeast Asia, and also women also recruited, as our dear friend Dr. Banaroi mentioned, the so-called comfort woman. Taiwanese women also gathered together with Korean women and also women from the Philippines, sent to these battlegrounds to support those military invading in Southeast Asia. But of course, leaving aside, Japanese colonial government also set up their administration in Taiwan. And of course, Taiwanese people altogether were treated as secondary citizens. And this is quite likely they tried as much as they can to take those resources from Taiwan. This is just a part of the evidence. Japanese were utilizing very cruel measures rule Taiwan. And I think the other part of the story is nationalist government in Nanjing tried very hard to connect and also gradually move to Chongqing during the wartime. And some part of Taiwanese young men joined the army in mainland China, fighting against Japanese army. And this was the important history.
Zhao Hai, let me go to you. I mean, it's a very heavy casualty that China suffered, including other peoples in Asia, at the behest of the aggressors. In China alone, 35 million were believed to be the casualty, including Chinese soldiers and civilians. Over the world, it's about 100 million casualties altogether. What kind of role has China's victory and the Asian peoples' bravery and defeat of Japanese aggressors in terms of the overall liberation of people from the rampage of Nazism?
Well, it's very important at this point of time to remember Chinese people and also all of Asia's people's contribution to the victory of World War II. I think the previous panelist has already discussed how the world has forgotten this part of the world, the battleground or theater during World War II, is because the Western or European central idea about the World War II. So much about the stories, the movies, and the narratives until today is mostly around the Western narrative, and particularly around the theaters in Western Europe. However, it's very important, as you mentioned, that there are greater sacrifice in China, in Asia, in terms of human sacrifice, in terms of destruction of property, and in terms of the brutality of the war, including the dropping of American bombs, including nuclear bombs against the Japanese people, civilians. So altogether, I think the Asia theater or the sacrifice of the Chinese people is worth noting and need to be retold in this anniversary of 80 years victory in World War II. One more thing is that I think the Cold War is also mentioned because the Cold War, the United States changes policy against Japan, against Japanese militarism, and that's why there's a erasing of memory and changing of narrative in the 1950s. And so that's why I think today many Japanese and many people in Asia don't understand, don't remember don't recognize correctly the history, the past history during that time.
Romel, let me go to you. How do Filipino people think when they watch Japan commemorate the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, themselves, of course, being victims of the first use of nuclear weapons? But what is on the mind of the Filipino people when they're watching this and seeing that the Japanese over the years have toned down considerably what actually happened in their history book? For instance, instead of invading China, they say they entered China.
Well, of course, we empathize with the Japanese when they suffered the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because we also suffered the same thing. We suffered from invaders, outside forces. So we empathize with the Japanese, but at the same time, we also want historical accounting of Japanese abuse in the Philippines. You know, in the history books, what is commonly mentioned in the Philippines are incidents like the Manila Massacre involving 100,000 Filipinos and the Bataan Death March. But what is not being told is that there are various massacres all over the country, you know, and there are various abuse happening in the Philippines. And right now, Japan and the Philippine governments are prioritizing economic relations and diplomatic ties. But me, as an academic, I want to still stress the need for historical accountability of Japanese abuse. So while we empathize with the Japanese about the abuse that they suffered during the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it also reminds us that we also suffered the same abuse from the Japanese. And until now, there's still no historical accounting of that abuse. My father was a victim of the Japanese colonial invasion, and my grandfather died because of the Second World War. Second World War. So we still feel the need for Japan to recognize their historical accountability for all the abuses. Until now, every now and then we see families of comfort women still crying for justice. And we need to face that squarely, because if we don't face that squarely, there will be a lot of unanswered questions that happened
Absolutely.
during the Second World War under the Japanese occupation of the Philippines.
Yeah. Yan, of course, Ramel was just a case in point when he talked about the suffering of the Philippines people. There are many other nations which also suffered during World War II and not getting their questions answered. But looking at the collective black hole in people's memory, especially people in the West, what accounts for, or what factors account for such a collective amnesia?
Well, you know, the the victors somehow always write the history, right? And secondly, you know, the post 45 world became one dominated by the Western powers, the US, of course, I don't have to mention the name. And if they are that insistent on dominating, running Japan as they were, and actually conducting the foreign policy of Japan and setting up a global set of bases in that area where people have been suffering so much, it is definitely in the interest of that. Of the constructors of that narrative to tone down the sufferings of it, including the sufferings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can see it today with Gaza. I mean, the suffering is covered far too little in the Western press. And it's called a war instead of a genocide and things like that. There will always be this violation, I think you can call it, of the human right that everybody suffering has the same right to be heard.
Do you
and
think there's
seen,
an element of
that some who are
racism
more
in this?
worthy of it than others.
I'm interrupting, because time is very limited. Do you think there's an element of racism in this?
Of course there is. The Western culture has always been racist. Look at colonialism.
Yeah, in terms of thinking that what happened in European theater is worth mentioning, that this is war, this is bloodshed, this is human lives being sacrificed. But because what happened in Asia is for the Asian people, the yellow skin, so it's probably not as important. The lives sacrificed there are probably just code numbers. Is that what you want to say?
That's what I'm implying, yes. I don't think we should be surprised about that. It has very much to do with world domination. the wish to dominate, as the United States unfortunately keeps on having it today, instead of recognizing that you have to join the rest of the world, you want to dominate it. And then you have a narrative that is very special, but not according to reality or to the diversity of the suffering. I mean, the suffering of Jews is evident, but it's overblown compared with the suffering of tons of other people around the world, and the sufferings of colonialism the same. This is a racist culture.
Mr. Zhao, I want to talk about the ending of the war. Again, there are different narratives. If you Google the internet, for instance, what you get is that the war officially ended. There was the peace treaty in so-called San Francisco peace treaty, but actually China doesn't recognize it. What's the problem with this historical account?
Well, again, the Cold War happened, and the Cold War disrupted the end of World War II resolutions and continuation of certain part of this aspect of the war. So you mentioned there's a San Francisco Treaty, but that's the treaty between Japan and Western powers. By then, the United States has already deeply in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and China, after 1949, the U.S. refused to recognize the People's Republic of China. So that's why those two major victors out of World War II was never in the San Francisco meeting, let alone being a signatory of the treaty. So after that, I think both there are problems because of that, because until today, Russia and Japan have unresolved territorial disputes, and until today, China and Japan have unresolved territorial disputes and other historical legacies. So I think you are right. By that account, there's still many unresolved problems because of the Cold War disruption.
Mr. Zhao, what have been resolved? Because there were the Cairo Declaration, there were the Potsdam Declaration, right, which are legal treaties which are recognized by China, by the United States, by the UK. And what have they resolved for sure?
Well, 2 points out of the Potsdam, first Cairo Declaration and then Potsdam. Number one, the Japanese are asked to unconditionally surrender. And that's what the Japanese did. But so far, many Japanese refuse to recognize. They just say, the emperor ended the war, not totally unconditionally surrender. Surrender, that's what the Japanese did. And secondly, after the unconditional surrender, the Japanese needs to renounce its claims of all the territories they occupied by force. So that means, and return those territories back to the original owner. So that means whatever territory the Japanese took from China after the end of the war is officially and legally returned to the Chinese sovereignty. So for instance, Taiwan, as part of China and occupied by force by the Japanese after World War II, after the Japanese surrender, is actually officially legally returned to the sovereignty of China.
We'll continue that discussion, which is a very important point to be stressed here. But unfortunately, I believe we have to wrap up here for this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. But we'll continue to focus on this topic. Many thanks for the moment to my guests, Jan Ahlberg joining us from Sweden, Professor Liu Fu Kuo joining us from Taiwan Province, Romel Banloy joining us from Manila, the Philippines, Mr. Zhao Hai joining us from Beijing, and Joseph Mahoney joining us from Shanghai. Thank you very much for sharing with us your precious insights. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for joining us. You've got The Point.